everyone. Welcome back to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and my husband, Bernhard Gunther. And on this episode, we are going to be discussing thought forms, egregores, and the mechanics of mass psychosis. So this is a podcast about the invisible energies that shape public perception, behavior, that shape the collective reality that we're living in, and that affect groups, cultures, and even entire civilizations. So these are energies that affect people without even realizing they're participating in them. Because what we're witnessing in the world right now isn't random. The world seems to be an endless state of polarization. It's being fueled by various kinds of divide and conquer strategies. It seems like there's an endless series of different kinds of mass psychoses popping up left and right. And as the collective shadow material increases, so do the projections and the chaos, because a lot of us or a lot of people in the world are not looking within. They're just projecting their own inner turmoil onto the world. And besides that, it's clear that there's an undeniable global shift happening in the world right now. There's also a splitting of different realities happening and a collective sense that the old way that we've been living, relating, and understanding reality with has no longer works. It's like we're left without a map of the new territory that we're entering. As we've referred to it in other podcasts, we've called it the fourth turning and explored it through that lens. Astrologers like myself relate this to different astrological alignments, specifically the outer planets all shifting at once. We've explored it through the Yuga cycles, through the Yuga Shift podcast. But whatever way you look at it, the general theme is it's very clear that the old world is dying and the other one, the new one, is yet to be reborn. So we are in this liminal stage and this birthing canal. And for many people, this is happening for them personally, and it's also reflecting what's going on collectively. We've noticed a lot of people, including ourselves in our own way, feel that we're almost strangely in between lives. We've noticed that many people in their personal lives, because of the intensity of what's happened in the past 5 years, they feel very overwhelmed, exhausted, feeling maybe a sense that they don't belong in the old world anymore, or maybe even their old life anymore, but they're not really fully understanding what is trying to be born through them. So if this resonates, we've designed exactly the program that's meant to help you through this shift. We will be relaunching this year our flagship 14-week private online group program in psychological and spiritual self-work, embodied soul awakening. So for those who have been through this program, you know this is not your typical self-improvement program. This is not going to be filled with new age spiritual bypassing. This isn't us trying to be all-knowing gurus. This is really a program that's meant to guide you back to your true self through a curriculum of holistic, grounded, and embodied inner work that really is meant to help you truly become the person you're meant to be. So this course is essentially a call for individuation, which is exactly what Pluto in Aquarius is going to be calling many of us to do. So over 14 weeks, we're going to guide you step by step through a program of what we call a fourfold path of a holistic self-work. This means we work on the somatic and nervous system level. We work on the psychological and emotional level. We also give you a clear intellectual understanding of the larger spiritual forces that shape our reality. And we give you a curriculum of various spiritual practices that are rooted in embodiment. So this is inner work that is meant for you to actually embody what we're talking about, not just intellectually understand these concepts. So we added a bunch of new material. I'm going to kind of list off everything we get into. So we're going to cover topics such as the process of embodiment, the path of awakening, shadow work and retrieving projections. We've added some new sections on the individuation process, which includes Jungian dream work and active imagination. We also include our part of our old program, which is focusing on somatic work, nervous system regulation, understanding how trauma affects the nervous system, its effect on relationships. We also go into unpacking the core beliefs that shape our perception of the world and ourselves. We go into inner child work, parts integration. We go into ancestral karmic, past life wounds, and integration. We talk about evolutionary relationships and conscious relating. We've added a new section on spiritual psychology, which I feel is really meant to be the future of where psychology is going and leading to in this new era. We have sections on the hyperdimensional matrix control system, the occult and hidden forces of life, Wetiko, entity interference, psychic attacks. So we cover these esoteric topics that a lot of conventional psychological and self-work programs don't cover, but we also cover them in a very grounded, embodied way. We also go into critical thinking, how to develop deeper discernment, how to align with divine will, soul purpose, dharma, and we have a very popular section on evolutionary astrology and soul evolution, where we go through the different Pluto generations. We show you what your Pluto placement is and how you are meant to evolve in this lifetime. Just to give you an idea of how the structure is set up, we have a weekly call with both myself and Bernard every week, either with coaching and Q&A or sharing with an intimate community of other people who are dedicated to inner work. And this is really important to have this right container, because it does help you get through things faster and helps kind of build momentum when you're doing this work with other people. For people who have been through like meditation retreats, for example, you know that it's highly unlikely you're going to meditate for 8 hours a day alone, but you will do it if you're with a group of people. So we apply this to the idea of self-work, is that it's easier to go through this pretty in-depth course with a group of people who are also doing this inner work. And there's an amazing synastry that tends to happen with this specific group of people. We also have a lot of video, audio, and written teachings, way more than you can even consume in the 2-week period you're going to be given it each week. Each module releases every 2 weeks. We also have guided somatic and spiritual practices. Throughout the whole course, we will also have a private Telegram group where you can ask us questions, chat with other group members. As mentioned earlier, I'm also going to give you personalized evolutionary astrology insights, tell you which Pluto sections to read that's very specific to your chart. If you want to go deeper, you also have access to one-on-one sessions with myself. I offer evolutionary astrology coaching, and Bernhard offers holistic coaching. And you're going to have access to a very thorough library of practices that you can use for years to come. So we've made some changes to the structure of this program in response to people who have previously been in the program who would like more support. So what we're going to do this round is we have a core program, which is a 14-week live program that has weekly calls, bi-weekly teaching releases. That's the most intensive period of the program. And then after the core journey, what we've included is an option to continue into a 6-month integration space where we will have one live call per month. No new material will be released, but an option to ask us questions about the material, to share your process, and then the Telegram group will continue where you can discuss your process with other community members. And another thing we're going to offer as an option to add on later is, for the first time ever, we're going to be doing an in-person retreat in Sedona this fall. You have the option to join or not. It's not included in the registration fee. However, we will announce what the details of that will be later. And it is only going to be for people who have been through the program. And we may even open it up to people who have previously been through the program. If you're listening and you always wanted to come to Sedona, we'll let you know when we have those details. So this program is really for people who like depth, who are really interested in true, deep transformation. They want practices that actually work, and they really sense that the real change in the world is going to happen with the change of consciousness. And we also don't promise quick fixes, because the truth is this is an ongoing journey. We're giving you practices that you're meant to be able to apply for the rest of your life. And we're offering tools that we know actually work, because we use them on ourselves on a daily basis, and we've tested them over years with our work with people. So if you feel the call, we invite you to apply by visiting thetimeoftransition.com. That link will also be in the show notes as well. If you want to go to that directly, you can go to veilofreality.com as well. It's going to be listed on Bernhard's page. And our next round will start March 18th. And that 3 or 14-week intensive period will run until June 21st. And then we have that 6 months of integration. So we try and keep these groups intimate. We limit them to 40 people. We divide that in half to certain calls so that it's not overloaded with too many people sharing. And yeah, if you want to learn more, visit thetimeoftransition.com. On that page, we have all the details. And you can also read over 50 testimonials from others who have taken this program if you want to decide if it's going to be right for you. So we hope to see some of you there.
Excellent. So, with that being said, let's dive into thought forms, egregores, and the mechanics of mass psychosis. So let's start off with a very general assumption most of us, if not all of us, have, right? That rarely gets questions. We experience ourselves as separate, self-contained individuals, and most of us believe that our minds live inside our brain for some, that we are the creators of our thoughts, that our thoughts are private, self-generated, sealed off from the world and from others. We somehow assume that each of us live inside our own mental bubble, and thoughts are produced exclusively by neurons firing in the brain. That's like the consensus materialistic view. But this view has also become so normalized that it feels like common sense, but it's relatively a recent belief, actually, rooted in a materialistic worldview that emerged alongside modern science in this current age of hypermaterialism in right now. And this is a worldview obviously shaped that anything can only be measured through our 5 senses. But humanity was not always this cut off from the unseen, right? The split, you could argue, started a long time ago in the past golden age, 12,000 years ago. But even back in this couple thousand years ago, we were more in touch with the spiritual world. But all of this changed dramatically in the Age of Enlightenment in the 17th century, also called, ironically, the Age of Reason. And since then, we have become increasingly more mentalized, increasingly dissociated from the body, and also more disconnected from the spiritual layers of reality, which our ancestors were actually more in touch with. And especially nowadays, with the rise of AI, transhumanism, and constant technological stimulation, this disembodiment has reached a whole new level, right? Most people completely only live in their quote-unquote heads, so to speak. Human attention is pulled outwards into abstraction, while the inner life, the soul perception, the soul organs, the spiritual organs, and subtle awareness beyond the 5 senses continue to disintegrate. And at the core of this lies one of the greatest illusions humanity lives under. And that is the sense of an independent identity and persona, separate and impenetrable from everything else. It's the greatest illusion and spell we've fallen under. But in reality, the human mind is porous, meaning we are not isolated thinkers. We are transmitter stations. We are receivers, transmitters, and amplifiers of forces and beings that move through us, which we also can experience as thoughts. Our consciousness is really influenced by collective fields, by other people, by the environment, by non-physical forces that operate beyond the limits of material perception. And again, this understanding is nothing new. Every esoteric and occult tradition has known this for centuries and ages, even as the great occultist Dion Fortune said, quote, "We live in the midst of invisible forces whose effects alone we perceive. Human consciousness is not a closed vessel. Cosmic forces circulate through it at all time, like seawater through a living sponge." End quote. Now, once this is understood, a whole different set of questions emerge, right? What are thoughts really? Where do they come from? Which ones are ours and which ones are not? So let's dive into it. In part 1, we will challenge this modern belief that thoughts are produced by the brain and sealed inside the head or the individual. We will explore the esoteric view that thought is a real force in the subtle planes, etheric planes in the astral realm, and that the mind is often a receiver and transmitter of influences and not the sole origin. We then get practical and break it down how thoughts and emotions generate thought forms, also called elementals, energetic entities created by mental activity and emotional charge. We cover how they formed through repetition or obsession, how they can attach, drain energy, and influence behavior, and how resonance determines what you attract and feed. From then we scale it up to a very important topic, especially nowadays, to the collective level, and examine so-called egregores, group thought form entities created by movements, ideologies, and mass emotional identification. We look how they spread through crowds and online spaces, how they feed on projection and outrage, and how they can override individual consciousness. In part 2, then, we go deeper for the members. If you're not a member yet, you can access all part 2s via signing up to the podcast membership on my website, veilofreality.com. So in the second part, we explore the mechanics of thought forms and egregores from a transpersonal psychological perspective, specifically the concept of mass psychosis and mass movements through the lens of Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, showing how the loss of individual consciousness, shadow projection, and emotional contagion allow collective forces to take over the psyche. We examine why mass movements feel righteous and absolute, how individuality gets lost in the crowd, and why unintegrated shadow becomes the primary fuel for psychic epidemics and collective violence. From there, we also dismantle the popular idea that thinking positive is the solution. We show how many negative thoughts actually originate not in the mind, but in suppressed emotions in the unresolved shadow, and how forced positivity often deepens more repression and feeds actually parasitic thought forms, entities, and so forth, instead of dissolving them. Then we go deeper then into the psychospiritual solution, conscious, emotional integration, shadow work, and how to restore the conscious eye. And then we explore how thought forms and elementals operate in close relationships, how suppressed emotions distort relational fields, and why good intentions are not enough, especially in relationship dynamics. Finally, we bring it all together and show you how really the process of individuation ties into all of that to gain inner sovereignty, and why the real way out of mass psychosis, egregores, and collective manipulation is about integration and conscious presence.
Okay, so let's begin with talking about what thoughts are and how they are created. So to understand thoughts correctly, we have to step outside this modern assumption that thinking is produced by the brain and is confined to the individual. So in the esoteric view, thought is a real force, but it operates in the subtle planes of existence. It has concrete effects on the individual, other people, and the collective psychic environment that we live in. So thought is not something that merely happens inside of us. It's not some random neural pathways firing off. It's something we participate in consciously or unconsciously, and it's happening through a field of consciousness. So if you look into multiple esoteric traditions, thought is understood as rising in the subtle planes of consciousness, and it expresses itself through the human being. So the mind and the brain are not the originator of thoughts. They're just the receiver, the interface through which thoughts are received and they're transmitted into the world. So, I mean, various spiritual teachers have talked about this, from Sri Aurobindo, who talked as the mind as a receiving station for universal mental forces, Rudolf Steiner, who emphasized that thinking itself is already a spiritual activity in which human being participates. I even believe, I'm not sure exactly what the studies have been, but there is more and more, even through materialistic science, proving that thought is a receiver of things rather than a transmitter itself.
They come always with these amazing scientific breakthroughs and discoveries, which all the esoteric teachings talked about for thousands of years, really, right?
Exactly. So with that context in place, the nature and origin of thought can be stated in the following ideas. 1, thoughts are not the byproducts of the brain. That's a materialistic view. A thought is rather an energetic event that arises in subtle planes of consciousness and expresses itself through the receiver of the human mind. It's a vibration and force that tends to carry a specific quality, intent. So in this framework, the human being is not the one who produces most thoughts, but the receiver, the modifier, and transmitter of them. So thoughts originate in the mental astral plane, not the physical brain. So the brain functions as an instrument similar to a radio that kind of picks up different transmissions. And it translates thought into language, action, physical responses. It doesn't create a thought any more than a mirror creates the image it reflects. So most human thinking is mechanical. It's shaped by habit. I would say it's shaped by cultural, familial influences. It's shaped by collective currents. If you see all of a sudden, people start repeating the same words, that kind of points that this thought is not their own. And only a small portion of thought is consciously formed. Some people have no ability to create any thought, but they're just empty receivers for collective thoughts and mass movements, which they identify with. So this is popularized in the NPC meme, which I know people find very offensive and get very triggered by, but it actually points to an esoteric truth that some people just repeat these programs that they're given. And what they're pointing at actually is the egregore and thought form, that they're just being fed a program from this collective etheric field and they're just repeating it. So what most people experience as their thoughts are borrowed, they're inherited, or they're group thoughts that are absorbed from the mental atmosphere that they're in. It can be coming from their familiar conditioning, cultural. It could be coming from what Jung calls the spirit of the times that they live in. This is not always bad. We have even our specific way of using language reflects the spirit of the times. If you read a book written in 2026 versus the 1900s, it's a very different way of using language because we're all tuning into this collective thought form. So true thinking requires a higher level of consciousness. It requires being aware of your thoughts, your mind, and self-discipline as well. A lot of us are just running programs. For example, when you sit down and meditate for the first time, all you realize is all these different thought forms coming at you and just thinking without you consciously doing it. So this is this mechanical thinking that we're pointing at. And this is the thinking that's most susceptible to external forces and beings and thought forms and egregores that tend to think through us. So the moment a thought arises, it creates a subtle vibration in motion in the mental and emotional field. And these vibrations will tend to crystallize and take form as an etheric thought form. So I can produce a thought form right now by thinking very intensely about something. And I would also argue the more emotional charge I put in it, the more energy I put into that thought form. And a clear and focused thought produces a more coherent form, whereas a confused or emotionally charged thought produces a distorted one. So once formed, these thought forms do not remain confined to an individual. They can travel through the mental atmosphere. They can live in your home. They can travel through different environments. They interact with other thought forms in the environment. They interact with other human beings. And they'll influence the moods, the impulses, the decisions, the actions, often without conscious awareness. So when we talk about like telepathy, we're really talking about someone picking up on a thought form that's in the room, basically. So telepathy is just us picking up on someone else's thought forms, basically. So we have these thought forms circulating constantly in the atmosphere around us. Most people will just pick them up, identify with them, and assume that's my own thought. And without having that inner stillness and discrimination, you will become an open field for random, habitual, sometimes even very negative thoughts that are in the environment. So this means your thoughts are not just a private event happening within your own brain, that your desires, your fears, your beliefs are not only affecting others, but you're being affected by the activity and thought forms of others. So we have this kind of interwoven field of both individual and collective thought forms just pervading the atmosphere. We're swimming in it all the time. So to think, therefore, is not merely to have thoughts, but to take responsibility for them. And, the magic of having some sort of spiritual practice is you learn to disidentify with thoughts. That's like the fundamental beginning point of any spiritual practice. So what you're doing is you're also decreasing your unconscious reaction to different thought forms in your environment. You're just witnessing them and you're not grasping onto them. You're not feeding them more. You're just letting them go. So true thinking will happen when a person becomes conscious of a thought. They will be more discriminating on which ones that they'll allow to happen. And they also will shape their thoughts deliberately as well, because every thought will carry a certain consequence to it. So whether we are mechanically absorbing them or we are consciously creating them, the thoughts that we think contribute to the overall mental environment that we live in, that others live in, and that creates the world.
All right, let's now look more specifically into the mechanics of thought form creation. So that gets really deep. This goes beyond the usual New Age or thoughts are things. And I'll show you also more through this exploration, especially also in the second hour, while this whole idea of you create your own reality by just what you think and focus on is very oversimplified, and why positive thinking can also be really easily abused and not really create what you think you want, so to speak, because the devil, as it is being said, is always in the details, right? So let's dive into it. So each thought, as Laura just said, or emotion as well, because especially thoughts are infused with emotions, generates a subtle energetic form in the astral field, which the esoteric occult teachings call an elemental, also, or a thought form entity. Now, these formations then populate the subtle planes of existence, the astral and etheric realms, and contribute also to the collective psychic environment in which we all live, the personal and collective. Whether born of conscious focus or unconscious reaction, then these thought forms or elementals take on a life of their own. You literally generate your own entity, so to speak, right? Like a seed cast into fertile soil, they grow, multiply, and sometimes return to influence the creator. That ties into another topic of the law of rebound, that any thought form also comes back around, even especially negative thoughts, right? So you have to deal with the karmic consequences of whatever thoughts and emotions you project, identify with, and so forth. It's a very common occult law. It's kind of the hidden ecology of ecology of the psychic life, which most people are completely unaware of. Now, what are elementals? Now, elementals are energetic entities, right? As I just said, created by your own thoughts and emotions and intentions. They are shaped by the quality and intensity of the originating thought or emotion. They are autonomous in the way that they can persist and act independently, especially if nourished repeatedly as well. They're also bound by resonance, meaning they seek environments and people or groups and mass movements and situations or even places and environments that match their vibrational frequency. Every thought, feeling, and impulse, so to speak, creates a living energy, right, in the subtle realm. That's the elemental. And obviously, positive thoughts generate more warm, expansive, nourishing, and peaceful etheric forms. Negative thoughts produce contradicting, chaotic, and aggressive forms, right? Even Rudolf Steiner said, if you project hate, anger towards someone, it's like in the astral realm, it's like darts shooting on in the other person can have more detrimental effects than even physically hitting another person. But again, remember the law of rebound, you will still have to deal with the karmic consequences of what you may project onto others. This is a whole different topic. Now, every human being, and that is known in the esoteric occult tradition, produces tens of thousands of elementals daily, consciously or unconsciously, not just produced by your own conscious creation, obviously, as Laura just talked about, but which we attract and feed from the collective field. So elementals can be obviously helpful or harmful, nourishing or parasitic, peaceful or chaotic, again, depending also on the level of consciousness that created them. So this process unfolds in certain stages. Number one, the mental conception. A thought arises, right? Either from your own unconscious or you identify from something that's floating in the mental ether. It could be neutral, negative, or positive. Then you give it an emotional charge. Then it's infused, especially with strong emotion, be it like fear, desire, anger, love. The thought form becomes even more energized. You give it power. And then repetition and obsession. The more often this thought emotion loop is replayed, the more solid and autonomous the elemental becomes. And we all have our habitual thought forms and emotions. You know that if you're really aware of yourself. Number 4, projection or retention. The elemental may stay in your field, often attaching to your aura. That's when you have thought loops or consistent habitual thinking that are literally elementals embedded in your aura that get reactivated, and anytime there's a trigger or whatever, it activates it. Or you project it to another person, or they can also linger in locations. And then number 5, influence and return. These elementals can begin influencing behavior and perception, be it yours or someone else's, and again, eventually return to the originator according to the law of rebound. They are called law of rebound. Now, there are different types of thought form entities. They are so-called fleeting elementals. They're kind of brief, weak thought forms from passing emotions, right? We all, considering humans produce 10,000s of elementals every day. Obviously, not all of them are very strong. Most of them would argue are fleeting elementals. They dissolve quickly unless charged repeatedly. Then there are more persistent elementals. They are built from chronic, especially negative self-talk, obsessive thoughts, or strong desires. They become semi-autonomous and embedded in the aura, as I just described. Then there are projective elementals. They are directed towards others, consciously or unconsciously. There can be hate darts, anger, envy, jealousy, sexual fantasies, right? Projected towards others, which also the other person could easily, depending on their level of consciousness, absorb and feel and affect them. Obviously, it can also be with positive projections as well. Then there are collective elementals. These are thought forms co-created by groups, by masses of people, which then evolve into egregores. We talk about egregores shortly more. Very important topic, especially nowadays. Now, elementals feed off attention and the emotional resonance. They find entry points through unconscious identification, right? For example, we all have unconscious core beliefs, which we're not aware of. I'm worthless. I'm not good enough. I will never find love. Whatever it may be, unconscious negative core beliefs can attract negative thought forms, right? That's why, again, we'll talk about this more specific in the second hour. Trying to just think positive is just symptom management. Emotional reactivity, right? That can also feed certain elementals, attract certain elementals, especially unprocessed anger, grief, or shame. Mental fixation and looping thoughts, and ultimately, right, energetic porosity when your aura is already weak, all kinds of elementals can come in. So in short, the more you dwell on a thought form, the more you're identified with it, and especially the more emotional charge you give it, the more you attract these elementals of the same kind. That's important to understand. From the mental astral plane, which then get embedded in your aura, right? So you can even originate some thought of yourself, but it will attract the same thoughts of the same frequency. So all of your recurring habitual thoughts are elementals embedded in your aura. They can, like I said, easily get activated with a corresponding trigger, emotion, or event, right? And over time, we have more and more of these habitual thoughts as we grow older. And if not integrated or transmuted, these elementals can drain your energy, also influence your behaviors, desires, decisions, aims in life, all of that. Especially if you take on other thought forms, that's why I always question, where do your desires come from truly? Are these yours? So now we talked about elementals, and now let's dive into egregores.
Okay, so an egregore is basically a collective thought form that has become an entity and has a life of its own. So how an egregore is born is through people having similar emotionally charged thoughts. It can be towards an individual, a group, and it starts to form its own energy, and that energy compounds. And I want to point out that these can be filled with what we perceive as positive emotions, joy, inspirational feelings, or more difficult emotions, rage, envy, etc. Or it can be a mixture of both. But lately, what we see in response to the collective shadow material that's arising are more egregores fueled by emotions that humans tend to not want to accept in themselves and hence suppress. So the thing is with the shadow is we do tend to suppress material that makes us look bad. We don't want to accept that we are envious or hateful or we have rage. We tend to suppress more negative emotions into the shadow. So, our jealousy, our hatred, our desire, our instinctual animal nature. Unfortunately, this is the material that tends to create egregores in these times because this is material that human beings tend to suppress through our own social conditioning. So on an astral level, these emotionally charged thoughts result in this creation of an egregore, which is a non-physical entity formed by the collective and emotional and mental energy of a group. So it begins with a shared belief, a charged thought, or a charged emotional focus, and over time, the egregore develops an independent existence. It feeds on the continued emotionally charged thought forms and projections of the group. And then you have this egregore, think of it as like an etheric entity that begins to broadcast these thought forms telepathically into the collective consciousness. So similar to like how if I start thinking the similar thought in my home, I can create an egregore. Think of it almost like a cloud in the atmosphere of my home. This can really, literally be like a cloud over entire nations, over the entire world. And it becomes bigger and bigger the more people feed into it. And it starts to affect the collective consciousness. It starts to influence the thoughts, the emotions, and behaviors of those who tag into it, who resonate with it, who come in contact with it, but especially people who are more emotionally open or more weak-minded or suggestible, or some part of them resonates with that egregore's frequency. They become more easily psychically infected, and they'll think and feel and act in ways that they normally wouldn't. And I would also argue that one of the aspects of psychospiritual work is to develop your real I, your real center within your own individuated soul. And the less that you are identified with that, the more that you're going to be susceptible to mass movements, because you're just going to be going along with the waves of culture and the various egregores within it. And also as well, the egregore tends to tag into shadow aspects of us. It will entice us to project that shadow externally, usually onto a chosen group or scapegoat. So a lot of the egregores we see these days is usually related to some sort of us versus them narrative, where you're on the side of good and then the other people on the other side are on the side of evil. So this is just basic projection of the shadow onto the scapegoat. The shadow always wants a scapegoat, whether it's an individual or a person. And this is non-local. So this is not just, it can occur in physical proximity. So for example, you're going by a protest and all of a sudden you feel charged with emotion and you just want to join in, or, you can see it even at concerts, for example, something more benign where it's like you're at the concert and there's this collective field of energy building, right? So it's not always negative, but in these times, since we have a lot of shadow material uprising, a lot of them are experienced quite negatively. Or also online and social media. Like you see these egregores all the time where all of a sudden everyone's saying the same phrasing, whether it was BLM and I can't breathe, or now we have this ICE kind of protest thing. And then people are using the same terminology even that they use through BLM. So you just constantly see people repeating the same phrases, thinking the same thoughts. It's like their opinions are not their own anymore. You can literally predict what they're going to say via the egregore that they're tagging into. So the egregore exists beyond space and time. It functions in the psychic field. It also relates to Wetiko. We've had Paul Levy on our podcast, and he's explored that in his work. So once infected, as an individual or whether connecting to a crowd, you can temporarily or be fully possessed by that egregore. So we see this in this kind of mob mentality via cancel culture, where all of a sudden you need to attack people because they're not changing their profile pic to a black square or something. Like this is a perfect example of an egregore. Or any various political and social movements, right? So this and at its worst, it does manifest in violent behavior because this is kind of that aggression coming forward. So when fully overtaken, people will just act as extensions of the egregore. They're not thinking, they don't have a real I. It's like they're just being used by these non-physical hostile forces, and they're being influenced by these egregores, and they think that the egregore's voice is their own. And you also become you become vulnerable to various hostile entities that feed off of the negative emotion, what was termed louche by Robert Monroe, that's generated through this egregore. So louche, for those who are not familiar with this term, refers to emotional energy generated by humans, especially intense negative emotions. So these hostile forces feed on louche. They feed on conflict. They feed on violence. They feed on your rage. And Rudolf Steiner also spoke explicitly that there's beings in the spiritual realms that feed on fear, anxiety, hate, anger, violence. So these beings love these kind of egregores building because it's an easy way for them to manipulate a large amount of people through these thought forms. So when you notice this, I noticed this especially, I've kind of taken a break from, I don't want to comment on politics too much anymore because of the egregores involved, but I remember when I tried to convince people in my family not to take the vaccine, and they would just repeat to me stuff they heard on the news. It was just the same narrative over and over and over again, and the same thoughts, and they were tuning into the egregores. So you're not talking to the person anymore. That's why it's so frustrating to reach someone who's operating and being influenced by the egregore, because you're not even talking to them anymore. You're just talking to the egregore that's acting through them. And the good news is, for some, the possession is temporary, but for others, many people in this world have deep unresolved wounds. They've not looked at their shadow. They're spiritually, emotionally, and mentally weak, and they have a lot of suppressed emotions. Hence, the egregore will tag into all of these things, and they're easily possessed by this energy. And these online mobs that we see, this like cancel culture, like you need to do this, you need to speak up for this group, otherwise we're going to mob you, we're going to cancel you. That's just a powerful egregore that's turned into this powerful psychic energy. And a lot of people then just become emotionally entangled with them, and then they use this as a outlet to project their shadow. And so the egregore also grows in power as well as the more people tag into it. And on the contrary, it also loses its power the less people tag into it. Hence, the egregore of like BLM has like lessened, and now we have the egregore of like the anti-ICE stuff. So you see them grow, and like it's like they're very related to the spirit of the times, but they're also being fueled by the same suppressed unconscious material. And these can also attract other occult forces. It basically creates this massive feeding frenzy that just uses humans to generate louche, to generate this emotional energy. And then ultimately, if you look at it from a soul purpose perspective, it keeps us distracted. It keeps us fighting each other. It keeps us just circulating the same negative energy. Well, no solutions really come, because if you look at a lot of these mass movements, they've not really created change. They've just created more distractions, more ways for us to fight each other, more forms of divide and conquer, more mass psychosis. And it's really just battling shadows on the wall.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the solutions and the way out, so to speak. But before I dive into that, I want to be, again, very clear. And this is a very important point, because a lot of people would say, well, we just need to think positive. That's what we hear a lot. Just think positive, ignore the negative, create positive elementals and all of that. And there's truth to that, right? To take power over your mind, control your mind, create positive elementals and all of that. But that has become very oversimplified. So just trying to think positive thoughts, most often just forcing yourself even just to have positive emotion, is not the solution. And this is also a huge blind spot in many pop, spiritual, and New Age teachings, especially the create your reality stuff and all of this, right? Because this approach usually creates even a denser shadow that feeds the collective evil and only results in even egregores and only results in spiritual bypassing. But we'll speak about this specifically, how this works and how actually your repressed emotions and your repressed or suppressed emotions create more negative thought forms. So changing thoughts alone is most often only symptom management. So ultimately what it comes down to, again and again, this is the work of this age, is shadow work. It is essential, right, to avoid being pulled into mass-induced psychosis or online outrage cycles or feeding any egregores. Obviously, nervous system regulation is imperative for any spiritual warrior. Staying regulated in both body and mind, right, is the first line of defense against possession by all kinds of collective egregores, because when your nervous system is dysregulated, it creates the cracks through which the egregore and other thought forms can enter.
And you become also dissociated, which makes you easier to control.
Exactly. And the ego, obviously, in itself, the wounded ego is easily tempted to attack others. It feels good to project onto others, provoked by groupthink or an emotional contagion, right? That actually originates from the outside when you think it's your own. So the inner differentiation is so key again in this work. Obviously, that's easier said than done, right? I know it's from my own personal experience, because it's so tempting to indulge in the projection, because part of it feels good, right? To go off on somebody else. It feels justified. But these thought forms can also be created by other egregores or other entities that give you the justification to engage in this luge-producing behavior even more. So the solution really lies in cultivating enough self-awareness and staying grounded in the true self, as opposed to the ego personality, through psychospiritual work. That helps you to avoid being pulled into mass-induced psychosis or being overtaken by an egregore. Obviously, the ego will strongly be tempted to lash out at others and feed all of this madness. And the egregore and Wittig and other forces will install thought injections, which you will also mistake as your own, that seem to justify your hate, your outrage, your anger, your rage, or even violence towards others. But this is really the part of a very ancient occult strategy of divide and conquer, where non-human forces manipulate humans from unseen astral realms to pit them against each other for maximum luge production. Again, as Sri Aurobindo wrote, I've talked about this many times before, I've gone deep in this in my work as well, that human conflicts are, or behind human conflicts, there are enormous, unseen, occult forces manipulating events, while the ego believes itself to be free. But again, these forces also have their purpose and teaching function, right? In the esoteric tradition, they are seen as teachers, for they can only get you and manipulate you where they have an entry point within your being. Your unconscious shadow is an entry point. In other words, they highlight the issue you need to work on. So ultimately, the battle is never truly out there. It is through us and fought within. I always said the war is through us. And the more we can, win this inner battle and bring forth our true self, and the more we come in line with divine will, the more we have gained true free will and gained true creative power, even over our thoughts and emotions and all of that. Then you have more powerful effects on the external world than mechanical reactive activism or even protesting. In other words, the more individuated you are, and the more you have integrated your shadow and connected to self energy, the less you're influenced by the group's hive mind, mass movements, and collective egregores and all of that. So, now, with that being said, in the second hour, we go much deeper into the inner mechanics behind all of this, and most importantly, into real psychospiritual solutions. We will also explore mass psychosis from a psychological perspective through the work of Carl Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz, and how the loss of the conscious I makes people vulnerable to collective possession. We will look, as I said before, why just trying to think positive often backfires, and how suppressed emotions generate repetitive thoughts, and how unresolved fear, shame, grief, and anger become the real entry points for interference, regardless where you try to focus your thoughts on. We will explore why shadow work is practical or a practical necessity for sovereignty, and why avoiding or spiritualizing difficult emotions only strengthens the very forces and patterns people are trying to escape. And then we dive more into the interpersonal realm and explore how thought forms and elementals operate very powerfully in close relationships, especially intimate relationships or family dynamics, how unspoken resentment and unconscious projections create tension and conflict. We'll talk about emotional integration, nervous system regulation, and what is needed for protection and really true inner authority and inner resolution, so to speak. And we also, lastly and not least, will look at what individuation actually means in practice and how to reclaim this inner agency without withdrawing from the world, and how genuine inner work changes not only your inner life, but how you show up in relationships and the collective. And this is how you truly help the world. All right. And if you really want to go deep with all of that, even more in a practical way, as Laura announced at the beginning, we are taking applications and enrollment for our 14-week online group coaching program, Embodied Soul Awakening, from February 22nd until May 31st. It's limited to 40 committed spiritual warriors. You can find out more about it at the website thattimeoftransition.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll be right back.